Hello and welcome everyone. It's great to see you all start joining. I will give you a minute while we wait for people to get situated and connected. In the meantime, I'm going to launch our first poll. You'll see it pop up right on your screen here. I'm just curious, what's bringing you to today's webinar? Are you in those beginning stages of your TPRM program? Maybe a current prevalent customer? Is it educational? Maybe you just love attending webinars, it's your hobby, let me know. And let's begin real quick by getting some intros started. My name is Melissa, I work here in business development. And today we are joined by two special guests, Prevalent Senior Vice President of Global Products and Services, Alastair Parr, and Solutions Expert and Content Manager, Thomas Humphreys. Hello, guys.
Hello, thank you for having us.
Yeah, of course. And we also have our very own Scott Lang, VP Product Marketing here. Hi, Scott.
Hey, Melissa, how are you?
Good. And today, Thomas and Alastair are going to discuss NYDFS and third-party risk management and how it impacts you. So as a little bit of housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded, so you will get this along with the slideshow shortly after this webinar, and you are all muted. So use the chat if you need to communicate something that's not a question for the Q&A box. And without further ado, I will let Thomas and Alastair jump into it. Go ahead, guys.
Thank you very much. And just to reinforce, if you have questions that you'd like us to answer, try and weave into our conversation, please feel free to do so. Would reinforce the Q&A as opposed to the chat. That has a much better chance of getting to us, and we'll try and weave it in as we go through it. So thank you very much for joining us today. Just to reiterate, for those who haven't heard from us before, I am Alastair Parr. I'm the SVP of Products and Services over here at Prevalent. And why am I personally qualified to talk to you about this? I've had the joy of auditing for the best part of a decade in the past, particularly around third-party risk management programs. I've been exposed to hundreds of third-party lifecycle programs, and I'm joined today by the illustrious Thomas Humphreys. Thomas, why are you qualified to talk to us today about NYDFS?
Yes, hello Alastair, hello everyone. So yes, I'm the content manager at Prevalent, so I help to design and implement assessments situated across a variety of standards and frameworks, not least in information, cybersecurity and privacy, so the likes of ISO, NIST, GDPR, and of course NYDFS. Prior to this, I've been an ISO auditor for just under 10 years. Yes, many assessments across many different standards and frameworks.
Thank you very much, Thomas. Now we're all going to enjoy probing Thomas today and getting some insights specifically around NYDFS. But the things we're going to cover off in a bit more detail, we're going to introduce NYDFS in the sense of NYCRR 500, what it means. We'll cover off how to identify and classify third-party service providers specific to the framework. We'll look into applying due diligence when assessing third parties, and then move into continuities. How do we maintain it over time? How do we focus on resilience and recovery, and specifically on incident reporting requirements? So, Thomas, to begin with, please feel free to give us a bit of insight.
Yes, absolutely. And yes, welcome everyone to today's webinar. So, for those of you who are not aware of NYDFS cybersecurity framework, I'll get into some of the details a bit later, but I think it's worth just touching on and perhaps taking a step back at looking at what's happening not just in New York, but around the financial sector overall. And if you take a look back over the last 2 to 3 years, there's been a continual increase of many different threats, predominantly cyber-based threats. And these are growing. We've seen many organizations such as the IMF highlight their concerns where there needs to be stronger focus in applying security best practices. It's been reported that there's now close to just over 20% of phishing cases looking across the top or largest industries globally. More than 20% of those cases in 2021 were focused in the financial sector. There's been year-on-year increase in ransomware threats. And certainly if you look back between the beginning of 2020 all the way up to 22 and even into the beginning of this year, the volume of high-profile and notable attacks, such as SolarWinds, Log4j, and other targeted threats, have caused a rippling effect and a rippling damage across supply chains. And not least, this has impacted the financial sector. There's been an increase in web-based attacks, SQL injections, cross-site scripting, any targeted attacks on corporate websites and web systems, and anything to implant malicious code at a targeted level. And of course, we have the growing trend in the volume of supply chain and the increase in the supply chain and the reliance on suppliers. So what's causing this increase in cyber threats? Well, there's quite a few different areas that we can discuss. But perhaps the more pertinent one to highlight is this concept of digital transformation. Not a new subject, not least. It's been in place for probably close to 10 years now, if not a bit longer. But as we're seeing financial organizations spend more time and more money investing in new technologies, new applications and systems and solutions, it's increased the reliance on all of these different technologies, and with it, that greater reliance on the use of multiple third parties. And so we're seeing this effect of exposure and greater exposure to the likes of these phishing and ransomware threats and other attacks. And it's very much cyclical in nature because it now increases the visibility across the wider supply chain as well. And looking back towards how are we securing our journey through digital transformation and increase investment and application of technologies and technological services as well. So it's many threats increasing significantly, and certainly enough to warrant a lot of large scale and important regulators and organizations, not least NYDFS, to step up their game and to bring cybersecurity to the fore.
I suppose it's worth noting, Thomas, before you start weaving into a bit more detail specifically on the regulation. I appreciate it's very cyber-centric, but for everybody's edification on the line, we are seeing a lot of interesting trends where we're seeing additional focus. So cyber, of course, is a core component, as you expect, but the increased focus, as you may have seen from some of our other webinar sessions, on things like ESG, for example, being relatively topical, broader supply chain resilience, and of course, privacy in many areas. This is just one segment of a broader digital transformation we're seeing in the space, where people are starting to consider the events, geopolitical events, for example, or the environmental events that are occurring or impacting the supply chain in a bit more detail. So it's certainly interesting, but for the focus of today at NYDFS, Thomas, would you be able to give us a bit of insight into the regulation itself and what it's trying to achieve?
Absolutely. And let's start with a basic introduction. So I use the term NYDFS. You'll see a new term up here. We love our acronyms. For those of us who've been to a prevalent webinar before. And we're looking at the 23 NYCRR 500 regulation. So NYDFS is the actual department in New York State responsible for managing and distributing and ensuring that regulations are carried out appropriately and correctly. But the actual NYCRR is the New York Codes, Rules and Regulations, and it's this part of the framework that deals in cybersecurity. So this is a regulation that's been enforced by NYDFS, and the purpose is to provide quite a prescriptive but structured approach for organizations to apply cybersecurity best practices. As you'll see in slides coming up, there's quite a lot of different controls across a lot of different areas, some of them which will maybe very similar to the organizations, because as we'll see through the likes of NYDFS, when regulators such as NYDFS develop these frameworks, they are always focusing on where the best practices lie, best practices across not only their industry, but the wider industries and cybersecurity space as well. And so there's a lot of commonality between the control sets and the expectations of the NYCRR 500 regulation and the likes of ISO and NIST and other non-regulatory but best practice standards. So it's featuring both governance and operational controls, and we'll break down those controls in this short while. But very much the focus is that validation of saying, these are the best practice requirements that we require businesses to apply. And if they're applied correctly, it should be a good demonstration of your overall security posture. Of course, I talk about in the singular view in terms of an organization's application of the regulation. But as we'll see through today, there's also a very strong link and expectation of how you apply this framework to your third parties and to the wider supply chain as well.
Interesting. So Thomas, are you seeing any particular drivers as to why you're seeing this increased focus across various vertical specific regulations and frameworks towards the supply chain? You obviously touched on the fact that previously there's an increase of cyber attacks, but any real drivers that you've been seeing NYDFS taking to focus on third-party resilience and supply chain risk?
Interesting question. So yes, as you've already mentioned, obviously one of the drivers will always be where there are new and emerging threats and where there's a heavy increase in threat, such as the phishing and the volume of ransomware. But it's also, you typically find where, and perhaps this is where the digital transformation piece comes in quite neatly, because outside of if you take cybersecurity out of the equation, just focusing on the supply chain, where there is a need for a lot more interoperability between financial organizations, for example, and the need to have a more open environment and more open society, something which, of course, we've seen quite rapidly. If you look at the last 2 years and one of the offsets of the pandemic, in 2020, that caused a huge drive for a lot more capability for financial organizations and their customers to be able to interact with their customers in a better way, in a more seamless way. And of course, this has always led to, and it's always will lead to, an opening up of the supply chain and grabbing and interacting with more vendors. But as you indicated, Alastair, of course, one of the other offshoots to this, outside of cybersecurity, of course, is looking at those other areas that are becoming far more topical, such as ESG and the provenance of product and service that third party, that financial organizations are using.
Thanks, Thomas. So tell me more. What is the regulation?
So yes, I mentioned at the start that this is focused obviously on New York and New York State and financial organizations that are based and operate within the state. However, it's important to notice that even from the outset, NYDFS set out certain exemptions. And the purpose of these exemptions is not to say you don't need to comply with any aspect of the regulation, but given the type of organization you are, there may be a reduction of the type of controls and the volume of controls. So if we see on the left-hand side, organizations that have fewer than 10 employees, less than $5 million in gross revenue, and less than 10 million year-end assets. And at the bottom, those are organizations that don't have any control or access of information systems, non-public information. Looking at the right-hand side, do not need to comply with those controls. So if you see at the top level, they don't need a formal CISO. There's aspects around application security, audit training and monitoring that are not formally applicable. What do I mean by this? They can still implement them as best practice framework and as an overall best practice methodology and approach, but it means from a regulatory perspective, and when validating back to the regulator themselves, they don't need to provide that evidence to say, we have a CISO and the requirements that come with having an overarching role to manage cybersecurity in the business. So NYDFS have established a set of exemptions which they're carrying through even now when we're looking at the proposed rules, something I'll go into in a short while, because there have been recent proposed updates to the framework, which we're expecting to go live later this year.
Hey, Thomas, real quick, a quick question came in. Can you confirm if these exceptions are for the entity and not our third-party vendors?
So these are for what NYDFS lists as a covered entity. That is correct. Yes, sorry, I should have mentioned that. Apologies. So like all good regulations and frameworks, NYDFS sets out some clearly defined terminologies, and one of which is what it calls a covered entity, and it's these organizations that would have these exemptions in place. Yes.
That's it. Thank you.
Thanks, Thomas. And just to expand on that, I appreciate that there's some proposed changes specifically around things like expanded reporting obligations, etc. We will touch on that in a bit more detail further on as well. So thank you. Please do keep the questions coming. So, Thomas, could you explain the variances there between the governance controls versus the operational controls?
Absolutely. So this is now where we get into a lot more detail around how NYDFS is structured as a framework. So as you can see on the screen, there are 17 different bullet points. Each of these bullet points represents a different set of controls. So from cybersecurity programs and policies through to controls covering asset management, incident and business continuity, an area that we'll be covering later today, as well as operational or technical controls, if you will, around vulnerability management and penetration testing, the use of applications, managing access to systems, encryption, and many more. And it's important to note that I've specifically captured them in this way because given that there's a strong emphasis from NYDFS to create a structured approach or structured management system, if you will, when developing or implementing NYDFS requirements, taking the approach of the overarching governance approach, so senior management response, developing policy and process, establishing risk management assessments, and then looking at technical and operational controls that can complement those governance controls, I think is a sensible way to approach it. You may have noticed that there are 4 particular areas that are in bold. And this represents, and this is where the proposals comes into the fore. These are 4 areas where the wording of the subject of the control areas have actually changed. So, for example, under 500.04, in the current instance, we're looking at Chief Information Security Officer. This is now changed to Cybersecurity Governance, and again underlines some of the proposed changes that are coming in, that are explaining that, yes, Chief Information Security Officers are important in the overall oversight and reporting line that they provide to an organization, but there's more emphasis on the use of senior management and board level management, if that's appropriate to the organization. So there's a lot more emphasis that we're finding in the expansion of many of these controls, and in a similar vein to the incident response and business continuity. So it's not that these topics weren't there in the current version, it's just that they've been expanded. And Alastair, if you wouldn't mind clicking one more time, I believe there is a little animation that should come up. Yes. And it's also worth to note this piece as well. So I talked in the previous slide at how there are some exemptions based on the type of organization you are, if you're not holding non-public information, for example, or information systems. Well, there's another rule around the concept of so-called Class A companies. And as you can see, it's almost taking it to the other extreme. So organizations who have revenue in excess of 20 million US dollars, who have more than 2,000 employees, and there are additional rules and additional controls that are impressed upon those organizations. So to give you an example, the requirement of having an independent audit come into the business on a yearly basis to conduct an assessment of their application of NYDFS. So again, it's interesting to see where they're maintaining those exceptions to say, we understand companies of 5 employees or less who have very minimal or very minimal interaction with sensitive information systems. Some of this may be too much for them, and so we need a more consolidated set of controls. And the other extreme, for those those larger organizations, there are additional controls that we need to impress upon them. So lots of change, lots of similarity with the structure and the purpose of the NYDFS, but there's some exciting times in terms of the type of controls that they're bringing out and they're expanding upon.
One of the things I've found particularly interesting, Thomas, is when people have been raising some of these proposed changes, specifically around some of the expanded reporting obligations. There's been some concern on how are people going to be able to effectively report, for example, let's say there's an obligation for 72 hours as being proposed in the event of a privileged account or unauthorized user getting access to a privileged account, or events that have resulted in ransomware, or even in some cases where there's been extortion and payments. People are concerned about how they're going to meet those obligations. And the thing I found quite interesting is there's a bit of resonance there with what we've seen in privacy across the board, where we've seen enforced reporting requirements for things such as GDPR. There was some initial controversy and concern about how that would apply, and then pretty quickly we saw the industry and the mechanisms react accordingly to make sure that people were able to A, identify such incidents and events in a timely manner, then B, start weaving and baking that into the respective downstream vendor contracts, so that if, say, a third party had an incident and a covered entity had to react accordingly, that the mechanisms are in place contractually as much as technologically in order to be able to support that. So there's certainly been some interesting conversations tied to the proposed amendments. I'm sure you've seen the same.
Absolutely, and it's always one of the key areas that we get faced with. I know not just for this, but for other areas you mentioned. If you look at privacy overall and the likes of GDPR, and even the more recent CPRA in California for the new Privacy Rights Act, and it's important obviously for the regulators themselves, and I think largely they do take that on board in terms of notifications to respond to the regulator, particularly suffering when you're looking at data breaches, and the diversity of the type of organization that they're dealing with as well. So a lot of this is taken into account, and it's important to note that. So yes.
Fantastic.
Looking ahead then, so I've mentioned there's been a few changes. I will briefly touch on perhaps some of the more pertinent areas I've sort of identified based on sort of 3 key changes. One that I've labeled as policy and process development, enhanced operational control, and then incident and business continuity. All of them with an overarching aim to improve and enhance on those concepts of security best practice. So we start with the first piece around policy and process development. So there's always been a need to have a security policy within NYDFS, and they've often listed a range of policies ranging from access control to asset management, for example, incident policy, and so on and so forth. And we've seen again an increase, or looking like an increase through the proposed amendment, not in the volume of policies and procedures or procedural documentation, but enhancements to those documents. So to give you an example, incident management and business continuity remained in the current, existed in the current regulation. That's been expanded out to have its own set of prescriptive controls and how a continuity plan is actually developed, and the key aspects that should be covered. Likewise for asset management, for example, an enhancement to the policy and the need for the policy to include end-of-life products. For example, what happens to an end-of-life asset and how is it disposed of in an appropriate manner. So there's been an increase in the governance from the concept of policy and process before looking at the technical controls. The enhanced operational controls, and I've mentioned three key aspects there: authentication, assets, and threat monitoring. So again, these are areas that already existed already do exist in the current framework, but have been expanded, and there's been adjustments to some of them, in some cases quite significantly. So to take authentication, for example, it was noted by NYDFS over the past 2 to 3 years that a control they noticed was not sufficient, or what was not being sufficiently implemented by many businesses, was around multi-factor authentication. There's now a separate control just focused around MFA. And again, this aspect is included and expanded within the access control components of NYDFS. So they've seen a need to enhance the requirement of how MFA is developed, or at what points in the process or in the system that MFA is being used. In a similar vein, threat monitoring and the frequency with which vulnerability assessments, penetration tests are carried out. And then finally, as we'll see in a few moments, an expansion, and quite a significant expansion, has to be said, around incident response, incident management, and the full end-to-end life cycle of business continuity and disaster recovery planning, process, and testing. And what's interesting across these three is each aspect of them, to a degree, has enhanced from a third-party perspective. So, for example, the way third-party policy is required, and what's required within that third-party policy, the relationship between your third parties and some of the technical controls, as well as the level of response that a third party should provide to you if it suffers an incident or an event that would cause it to enact a continuity plan, for example. So there's a strong link with third-party management across each three of these changes.
So I appreciate there's a fair few more significant changes really that's going to impact how people respond. Thomas, based on what you've seen with NYDFS in the past, I appreciate it's been going through the consultation process, looking for feedback into January. Do you have any, not that we're going to hold you accountable here, but do you have any gut feeling as to when that people can expect it to be enforced?
Yes, so typically when they go through these processes, they offer they give a guidance of, they always do it in days. I think it's 180 days or 6 months from the date of amendment. And the date of amendment was around October 2022. So I think we're looking at between the current expectation, because the consultancy piece is now closed in end of January. And so if that timeline is correct, we're looking at an April time period, between April and May this year. So not too far off, 2 months or so. But yes, the consultancy piece is now closed as of end of January. Which also means that we shouldn't expect any significant changes other than what's already out there in the proposal.
So would your general guidance be on that, Thomas, then to start making sure that we have the relevant control mechanisms in place to be able to accommodate the current draft as it stands in some shape or form?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, once it gets to this stage, there's I'd say once there's been the amendment, the process to review has now closed. It's given that we know we're looking at 2-3 months away, it's a very appropriate time to start looking at those changes, looking at how significant they are, looking at that gap assessment between what do you have now and what's required to change, and looking at perhaps the more significant areas that have changed, such as the business continuity piece. So yes, I think it's an appropriate time to start making those adjustments, or at least conducting those reviews to understand how significant those gaps are based on what you're doing currently.
Makes sense. So with that in mind, how do we actually start identifying, classifying third-party service providers? And one question we've had a couple of times actually is, how do we consider larger SaaS companies in this who typically are more reluctant to be able to actually share and allow things such as pen testing on site?
Yes, that's always a conundrum. It's always an area that causes a bit of consternation when dealing with those very large organizations. And cloud providers are always a good example of that. I'll come to that in a short while. So yes, if you think about from the outset of if you're starting off in the process, obviously we need to understand our third parties. We need to be able to identify who our third parties are, what they're doing, where they are geographically, the size of them, the complexity, how involved they are. So obviously from an NYDFS perspective, perhaps we're looking at, do they have access to any non-public information or information systems? What type of service offering are they providing that may be deemed mission critical to our end goal as a business? So really identifying each individual third party and starting to build a profile of them, understanding volumes of data they're processing, where they are geographically, how large of an organization they are they single source suppliers? This is often quite a critical area just to underline and to be aware of. And all of this information helps build up that picture of where your third parties are and starts to piece together how we approach assessing them, or how we're going to approach assessing them or engaging with them in terms of understanding what controls we need to enforce upon them or assess them against with regards to the NYDFS framework. One of the key aspects of this, of course, is the relationships and thinking about the supply chain, starting to bridge out the interrelationships between all these different suppliers and starting to see how complex the supply chain is, and using some of the profile-based information, obviously, to do that. And once, obviously, we're getting to the stage where we know who our vendors are, we know how large they are, the volume of vendors, we know where they are, and the type of products and service they're supplying to us, we can then hopefully start to look at how do we tier these organizations. So those organizations who are holding very sensitive information or data, for example, they're holding perhaps large volumes of financial records, or they're helping to process them for us. Perhaps we want to naturally capture these as tier 1, priority 1, critical third parties, versus other organizations that are providing consultancy work for us, maybe on site within our premises, but perhaps based on the complexity of the business would be further down the chain of tiered suppliers, so tiers 3s, 4s, 5s if necessary.
So
sorry, Alastair.
Sorry, so that's a quick question. So I appreciate that pragmatic and proportionate risk management based on profiling and tiering is pretty much the industry norm on that perspective. How much leeway and flexibility does NYDFS give in relation to understanding how compensating controls can address other requirements? So, for example, they may meet most of the core requirements, but let's say there's 1 or 2 gaps that might not be applicable based on profiling and tiering. Can compensating controls support that?
They can to a degree. It depends on the type of control. NYDFS do make it clear in many instances when it could deem a control, a compensating control, to be an adequate coverage for something that would have been more ideal. There is still a requirement for formal acknowledgement and sign off from a governance perspective. Before the proposal, the focus very much was on the CISO and making sure that they had done proper due diligence and oversight into making sure those controls are sufficient and they've been applied correctly. And yes, I don't see that changing in the proposal as well.
Interesting, thank you. So when it comes to actually establishing proportionate remediation based on control deficiencies, on the basis we have a set of mandatory from that perspective, and appreciate we need to actually start tracking any commentary or observations that we make, how do you tend to see due diligence being applied?
So, and this, yes, so I guess there's a couple of key points here, and this is where the NYDFS regulation and certain controls in the regulation become very pertinent and critical. So when you're thinking at the top level, applying due diligence and assessing it per third party, where do we start? And you should always start with understanding what your third party risk is. Now, we've gone through the concept of building a picture of our third parties, and again, sort of emphasizing the need to develop a clear risk management framework that NYDFS suggests. It provides that clear structure in terms of third-party risks need to be managed, need to be identified, need to be recorded, and continually reviewed. And that's really the first step in identifying what do we need to be focusing on when we're looking at our third parties. Because once we've identified those risks, once we've set a program in place in capturing those risks, we can then start to look at what are the most appropriate controls, not only from a governance perspective, but also from a monitoring perspective that we need to impress upon our third parties. Now, when I say impress upon our third parties, that's both from a contractual standpoint and saying, these are expectations that we need you to implement based on what you're providing to us, but also that ongoing due diligence, that ongoing review, audit, and performance monitoring, to making sure that those controls that are required by NYDFS and that are necessary in helping to address those risks obviously are being implemented appropriately. And of course, this ongoing cyclical nature of this process obviously helps build opportunities for improvement, and obviously acknowledging potential weaknesses, whether it's wider third-party program weaknesses from an organizational perspective, or improving the security posture of those third parties. On top of that,
specifically.
Yes. So outside of that, so once we've gone through the process of going through the risk assessment and we know the type of controls that we need to touch on with the third party, there's more questions that we should be asking ourselves. And again, where, as you can see, I've highlighted the 5 individual control areas. These 5 control areas represent notices with third parties. That is to say, where there are requirements that involve interaction with the third party in some capacity. So it's always important to look to say, well, what are we looking for, and what do we need to ask of the third party before we engage with them, and when we're starting to formalize those contracts and agreements. So firstly, obviously, how involved are the third parties going to be in our product and service? Are we outsourcing a significant component or function to a third party? Are we handing over data sets and other information for that organization to manage? Is there reliance on the third party for cybersecurity practices? The concept of outsourcing is not new in NYDFS, and particularly for smaller organizations, we see it as a very common approach to obviously engage in cybersecurity professionals, professional organizations, and consultancies, even down to the level of outsourcing the CISO role for businesses, something that was quite relevant and pertinent within the current framework. And of course, this brings out a whole new set of questions to make sure that, and again, something that NYDFS stresses quite clearly, that where there is a level of outsourcing or reliance on particularly security best practices or consultancy from a third-party vendor, or a third party, sorry, that they still adhere to the requirements of NYDFS. It's not so much to say we're handing all this information up to them, or we're letting a third party manage this for us, so we don't have to do anything. So there's a strong emphasis from the standard to say, if there is a lot of outsourcing and reliance from third parties, that you're still doing your due diligence on them and making sure that they adhere to the NYDFS. And then finally, obviously, does the third party interact with critical systems and information? So there's a few critical questions to ask when you're starting out on the journey, but also regularly when you're engaging with the third party to make sure, are the best practices that are being prescribed by NYDFS, are they being adhered to sufficiently and correctly? And you may have seen from the last slide, there was a particular control, 500.11, focused around third-party information security policy. And this is where the framework then really breaks down the individual components in setting up third-party due diligence. So if we can go to the next slide. And it touches on 4 key areas: identification and risk assessment for each third party, cybersecurity practices or minimum best practices, due diligence to evaluate adequacy of those cybersecurity practices, and periodical assessments that need to be carried out for each third party. Excuse me.
Oh, Thomas,
As you can see,
there we
go. So yes, these are 4 key areas of the security policy that have been so they exist currently in the current version of NYDFS. They've expanded very much across the proposed version as well, but it's really underlining that whole step process that I've identified in terms of understanding risks of the organization, working out, when you're looking at the NYDFS from each control clause, which are the most pertinent security practices that need to be implemented across a third party, and then types of due diligence. So whether it's audits, whether it's proactive assessments, whether it's performance reviews, and all of this then underlines the wider third party risk management program.
One question there, Thomas, which is,
yes.
So tied to the security policy, I appreciate that's more of a prescriptive document that outlines what we're going to do from a high level, and that tends to be supplemented by the process, and then the demonstration that the process is being followed. So if we were looking to self-audit from this perspective, what sort of evidence do you feel is acceptable to demonstrate compliance to the overarching policy statements?
Yes, so if we're referring to just the third-party security policy, there's a few key takeaways from here. So as you said, yes, it seems very much focused around, do you have one policy that sets out all of these practices? But beyond this, we'd also be looking at agreements and contractual statements. How do you incorporate those practices into the agreements of a third party? In terms of performance review meetings, and understanding the step process of how you do that due diligence, and the fallout from that is also critical. So if you're thinking about the concept of, we audit our third parties on a regular basis, what evidence can we show you to say that we've done that due diligence and they are performing? If they're not performing, here's where. So it's looking at establishing a framework or process or a function that enables us to capture risks and issues that come out from that due diligence, and ongoing processes to correct those issues and corrective actions. If you're looking at policies from a wider sense, again, it's important to note that I haven't done the count on this. I think you're looking at between 12 to 13 times policies are mentioned in the framework. In some organizations, if you think of those Class A or businesses, it might be that if you have Class A third party, they'll have 13 separate policies, and underline those policies individual procedural documents and other evidence that they could show. But if you're another organization that has 5 personnel, how do you apply that? You can't develop so many complex policies and documents. but there is important to say there's a lot of flexibility to say, as long as it's appropriate to fit the organization. So there's a few best practices we can apply in terms of sourcing for evidence or asking for evidence, whether it's documentation, whether it's meeting minutes, whether it's records of how risks are being managed. But it should all be taken into account based on the type of business, the type of third party, or the complexity, sorry, of the third party.
Yeah, there's a good point. I think it's certainly reassuring to know there's a degree of pragmatism in it from a sense of proportionate allocation of resource. So I appreciate some businesses are going to have the advantage of having whole audit and compliance teams to work with InfoSec to steer this, while others, as you said, certainly won't have that that opportunity. So pragmatism sounds like is very key there.
Yes, very much so.
Brilliant. So I'd love to know a little bit more, if I can, about the incident response process. So from a continuity, recovery, incident reporting perspective. So yeah, would you mind illuminating a bit more there, please, Thomas?
Absolutely. So I mentioned at the start that this is an area that has gone quite a bit of an upheaval, and in terms of expanding the control and expanding the description of the control. It's interesting that they do bundle it all together. Instant continuity recovery, or instant business continuity disaster recovery. Quite a mouthful, but it's all bundled under one control. And what they've done is they've expanded, or they're going to be expanding, this concept of developing an incident plan, an incident policy, and developing a set of BCDR policies. I've got a quote at the top of this page, which the new NYDFS will require. And they state that when they're developing response plans, companies should look to address cybersecurity events, including disruptive events such as ransomware incidents. And it's interesting that that is a specific quote coming straight from the framework. And I think it just helps to underline where the framework or where the regulator is recognizing some of these threats are becoming ever more relevant, ever increasing. And so they're asking companies, you should be paying attention to how you approach these type of disruptive events. So it's greatly expanding the requirement of how incident management should be defined, the need for setting processes for instant response, containing incidents, responding to incidents, and escalating in terms of communication paths. The actual reporting on the cybersecurity event and related response activities has also undergone a change and an expansion. And of course, this is where the third party aspect can also come into it quite neatly. So of course, you're looking at our own methods of how we respond to an incident, a cybersecurity event. When it comes to a third party, the importance to underline from a contractual perspective, if you yourselves who are looking after these systems, financial data, for example, if you suffer a breach or an event, we require you to notify us through an appropriate communication channel. So there's extra emphasis on that concept of roles and responsibilities, decision-making in the business in terms of what actions we need to take and at what point we need to escalate, whether it's from the third party back to yourselves as an organization, and the other way as well. So from yourselves as an organization, then back out to your customers and to the regulators themselves. So from an incident management standpoint, yes, there's been quite an expansion in terms of how response plan is developed and the roles, responsibilities, and objectives that sit around that. And again, this mirrors quite nicely when you look at the text, when you look at the requirement, what other frameworks have been saying actually for many years already, so the likes of the ISOs and the NISTs of the world. So I think it's quite encouraging that NYDFS have taken a lot of this best practice under their wing as well.
Yeah, I think it's quite telling as well in the recent changes. So your comment there and your quote, disruptive events as a ransomware, the fact that they specifically called out in some of the proposed changes about notifying within, I think it's 24 hours for an extortion payment.
Yes.
With subsequent notification on why that was necessary. I personally quite like the emphasis on the fact that people need to justify why they didn't have the proportionate measures in place to react to it through resilience and being able to recover in the sense of a ransomware event. So it's quite telling and shows the intent and direction, I think, of the documentation in question. Absolutely,
I think a lot more accountability and a lot more openness that I think they're getting from these businesses. Yes, it's going to be interesting to see some of those justifications.
Yes,
if and when they occur.
Hopefully there's not too many people making payments, and generally they have a robust and resilient way of recovering compromised data.
And of course, that brings us on to the next topic, which is again around BCDR. So I mentioned that from the outset that BCDR is not a new term in NYDFS. The interesting thing, however, was when you're looking at the older versions, it was very light touch, which can be fine if you're familiar with the subject area. The difficulty of making subjects such as BCDR light touch is it can be quite a complex topic in itself and in its own right. So again, I think it's encouraging to see that they've taken this idea of what's expected in developing a continuity in the DR plan or a set of plans with a lot of best practice guidance and expectation, again, many of which mirrors other standards and best practice frameworks that are out there already. So what are some of the key areas that this covers? So firstly, this expectation that you should be identifying all of your assets, all of your infrastructure, your critical infrastructure that's essential to a continued operation. It's always the starting point we look at when we're discussing sort of continuity plans and sort of scene setting, from business impact assessments and identifying, based on what we're doing as an organization, what assets are critical to us. Should we suffer an event? What would we need to recover at the earliest opportunity? Secondly, the communication piece. So the use of business continuity coordinators, communicating internally if a plan has to be activated, but communicating with all essential persons. And this is some text that again is pulled from the framework, from the regulation. So all essential persons in the event of an emergency. So who do we mean by an essential person? So we're looking at both internal and external. From external, also we're looking at key stakeholders, interested parties from customers to obviously the regulator themselves, but also the other way in terms of third parties, businesses that you may be relying on to help support a particular critical piece of asset or infrastructure or process. So there's an expansion in having clear communication channels when you're developing a continuity and recovery plan, whether it's as part of testing those plans or putting them into action should an event occur. And identifying third parties that are necessary to the continued operation. So following off the back of the communicating with essential persons, not just notifying them should an event occur, should a disaster that would force you to move your operation to a backup site, for example, or into different environments, but making sure that if we're reliant on a critical third party that's necessary to our top level assets and infrastructure, or areas that if they fell over, if they stopped operating, we could be in serious trouble with our with our customers, our key stakeholders. We need to involve them within our continuity process. Do we need to involve them from a testing perspective? And if we have a recovery plan that involves recovering to backup sites or to backup locations, do we need to involve those third parties as well to make sure that they can also supply in the time frames that we're setting ourselves? So there's a lot of expectation now, a lot of expansion. I personally think quite rightly in terms of making sure you've got a complete coverage of recovering any asset and infrastructure or systems that are necessary and important for the business.
One of the things I really take away from this that's interesting is that contractual clauses for communication and interaction with the supply chain is so key to being able to actually effectively apply any meaningful resolutions to this. So certainly interesting. So Thomas, if I was in an elevator with you for 30 seconds, how would you summarize what we'd actually do in order to be able to address the regulation?
Yes. So firstly, identify third parties. That's always a key starting point, getting to know who your third party is, what type of data they're handling, what type of assets, what are they doing for us for our critical operations. And that should wrap around, or what should wrap around that is the wider TPRM program of how we manage those third parties and identify the type of controls that we need to impress upon them, to review against them, assess them against, not least the areas we've just discussed around incident and continuity. And obviously, once you've identified those third parties, start understanding and developing those risk assessments regularly. And that's an important thing. These are never one time only and forget it, lock it away in a drawer. This is a regular process of reviewing risks across your landscape, such as those around phishing and ransomware that we've discussed at the start of the day. Reviewing that regulation, making sure you know the controls that third parties should be adhering to. If they're accessing sensitive systems, are access controls appropriate? Have you considered multi-factor authentication? If they're handling sensitive data, do you have that communication tree around how they respond to an incident or to a continuity event? And then thirdly, using that 500.11 control to help build a third-party policy, a risk management program, and start to, again, have that continual review cycle of, are our third parties, how do they have good security posture? And more importantly, is it aligned to what NYDFS is expecting?
Lovely. Thank you very much, Thomas. So I'm going to hand over to our lovely Scott Lang to talk about specifically how Prevalent can support complying against some of these regulations. But while we do, we will be launching one last poll. So over to you, Scott.
Thanks very much, Alastair. I just want to make sure you guys can hear me okay.
And indeed. Hi, Scott.
Awesome. Terrific. Okay, great. Just real quick, guys, one or two slides of how Prevalent can help you simplify the process of meeting your compliance requirements like NYDFS. Look, at the end of the day, I think you want to achieve three things with your third-party risk management program, regardless of whether you're trying to aim for an NYDFS type compliance regime, or just better practice, or just to defend against potential, cyber threats or other compliance problems that might come down the line. And that's number one: get the data you need to make good decisions, increase your team's efficiency and knock down silos between the groups that kind of argue a little bit over third-party risk, and then finally give your program the opportunity to scale and evolve over time and to meet kind of changing requirements. Look, if you're using spreadsheets to do this, I think and I know that that's not the right approach. You need to have some level of automation in there to collect the right controls information from your third-party outsourcers, vendors, and suppliers. Get that into a place where you can manipulate that data, score it, understand who presents the highest level of risk to you, and then recommend remediations to get them down to an acceptable level of residual risk over time. You can't do without data, and you can't do it if everybody's hands are on the plow. Look, at the end of the day, what our approach to addressing the problem of third-party risk management is to simplify and speed up vendor onboarding, give you a single source of the truth and a single process to manage vendors throughout the life cycle, streamline that process and close gaps in risk coverage, and then unify all the different internal teams that might be involved in third-party risk from the point you source and select a new vendor to the point where you offboard and terminate, that relationship. And we do that through a combination of our experts, our data, unprecedented level of data that we bring into the platform to help you make good cybersecurity risk-based decisions, and then a platform to automate, add workflow and reporting to close the loop on any number of risks that you see right in front of you now. Again, our goal is to help make you and your organization smarter, to unify your processes, and give you a much more prescriptive approach to closing the loop on third-party risk. What I have prepared for you guys is a compliance checklist specifically written for NYDFS 23, NYCRR 500, whatever. It's 13 pages, goes chapter and verse through the regulation, and then maps best practice capabilities, and then ultimately how prevalent can help to each one of those control group areas that Thomas reviewed on the webinar today. So this will come to you as a part of the follow-up with the recording and more. And with that, I'll stop talking and put you back over to you for questions. Sorry.
We are at the top of the hour, so I'm going to say my thank yous to Alastair and Thomas, and of course you, Scott. Thanks for, asking all these questions, everyone. We tried to weave as many as we could, but feel free to email info@prevalent.net if you still have a pressing question, and we can route that to the correct person for you. And lastly, I'm so glad you guys could all join us today, and I hope to see many of you in your inboxes and at a future webinar. Take care, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you.